In this paper, I want to find a way of articulating the relationship between biblical values on the one hand and the values of the modern West on the other, a way that gives full weight to both the profound influence that Christianity has had on shaping our culture, and also to the deep antithesis that exists between a modern secular and a Christian view of the world. I don't want to find some happy medium, some vanilla-flavoured middle ground in which we argue for some similarity between Christian and secular values and some difference, because I think that approach sells short both the influence of Christian values on the West and the antithesis between biblical values and the West. Now, those who have done any thinking in the area of the relationship between science and faith will have come across the quote-unquote conflict thesis, peddling the widespread but spectacularly incorrect idea that Christianity is and always has been the enemy of scientific progress. It's been expertly debunked by Alvin Plantinga and Peter Harrison, among others, but nevertheless it retains an important and ongoing influence on public perception. Today, what we're witnessing, I think, is another conflict thesis, not this time between Christianity and scientific progress, but between Christianity and social progress. This narrative is most vigorously and unsubtly propounded by the new atheist argument that religion, quote, poisons everything. But it's also increasingly being assimilated into more mainstream discourse, with suggestions, for example, that religious values and sensibilities are among the main obstacles to social progress in areas such as promoting freedom and equality or tackling climate change. However, in seeking to resist, rightly seeking to resist this growing conflict thesis, Christians must be careful not to make the equal and opposite error of assuming that the values of Christianity in the modern West are identical, and therefore of underplaying the real and important distinctions that exist between a biblical view of society and the unbiblical ideologies that, alongside the Christian tradition, shape contemporary society. If Christians are to engage faithfully in debates about the relationship between biblical values and cultural values, then we need a nuanced approach, one that can take account of the complexities of the relationships between those two sets of values. And that's why in this paper I take a biblical theological approach, trying to follow through the rhythm of creation, fall and redemption, precisely to tease out some of the complexities in the relationship between these two sets of values. Now, of course, much of our thinking about Christ and culture is still conditioned by H. Richard Niebuhr's 1951 classic, Christ and Culture, in which he sets out 5 broad tendencies in Christian thinking about our culture. The first he calls Christ against culture. It's the tendency of those who hold that the counterpart of loyalty to Christ, as Niebuhr puts it, is the rejection of cultural society. The second tendency that he describes is the Christ of culture. It's a paradigm that maintains that the great enlightener, the great teacher, the one who directs all men in culture to the attainment of wisdom, moral perfection and peace, is Christ. And Christ is behind all cultures. The third tendency, Christ above culture, holds that contrary to the Christ against culture position, God is the Lord of culture. And contrary to the Christ of culture position, God is not identified with, but is actually separate from culture. The Christ and culture in paradox tendency rejects any attempt to synthesize Christ and culture, and it holds to the corruption and unworthiness of all human faculties and all human endeavour, including our own. It seeks to do justice to the need for holding together, as well as for distinguishing between, on the one hand, loyalty to Christ, and on the other, responsibility for culture. And fifthly and finally, we've got Christ, the transformer of culture, a tendency which doesn't seek to escape this world into some sort of spiritual reality either above or after it, but as Niebuhr puts it, is directed toward the spiritual transformation of man's life in the world, along with the transformation of all aspects of culture. Now, useful tools though these undoubtedly are, one thing that strikes us about them, does it not, is that they're all static paradigms, assuming that a Christian understanding of culture is unchanging over time. But I think biblically this cannot be the case. Everything about which we as Christians think is shaped by the biblical storyline of creation, fall, and redemption, as I've discussed elsewhere at greater length in a series of talks that you can find in the notes to this video. So in the paper, what I was seeking to do was to elaborate an approach to the relationship between Christianity and culture that's in line with Don Carson's appeal to biblical theology in his Christ and Culture Revisited, where he says, that stance is most likely to be deeply Christian, which attempts to integrate all the major biblically determined turning points in the history of redemption. In this paper, I try to show the value of this approach in terms of one biblical passage in particular. It's 1 Corinthians 1 verses 17 to 31. And I think I've probably lost count of the number of times that I've had recourse to this passage when I've been trying to think through cultural questions from a biblical point of view. One thing that I find absolutely fascinating about Paul's argument in this passage is that it contains moments of radical affirmation of the cultural values around him, but also of staunch antinomy, staunch denial of those values as well. And it doesn't seek some happy medium between affirmation and denial, but it manages to strike both of those notes strongly and to shape a way of understanding culture that doesn't compromise either of those two positions in favour of the other one. And as we'll see, it's a passage that manages to instantiate its own model of a little creation, fall, redemption schema. It manages to emplot the arguments that it's talking about, not have a static understanding of a Christian approach to culture, but one that takes account of the different moments of salvation history. We can break this passage down, I think, into 4 distinct moments. In 1 Corinthians 1, Paul identifies 2 dominant cultural values, one among the Greeks of his time and the other among the Jews. Jews demand signs, that is, in the context of the passage, miraculous events, and Greeks, for their part, seek wisdom. To help us appreciate Paul's argument, we can represent it in the form of a diagram, with this demand for signs and wisdom as a line ascending from left to right. The rising trajectory indicating that these values embody, for those who hold them, something to be desired. They are aspirational. Now, Paul does not go on, we should note, to dismiss these desires out of hand. He doesn't just say that Christ has nothing to do with wisdom and power. But neither does he straightforwardly affirm the Greek and Jewish cultural values either. Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom, but what they get from Paul is the word of the cross, which would no doubt have been a huge disappointment to both of them. The cross is foolish. The cross is weak. It's hardly the wisdom and power that they would have been expecting. Christ crucified is represented on our diagram with a line descending from left to right, representing both the downward trajectory of Christ's self-emptying on his journey to the cross, and the letdown that this would have been for the people seeking wisdom and power. So for the Greeks who seek wisdom, the cross is stupid, moria, is the word in the passage from which we get moronic. And for Jews seeking for a miraculous manifestation of God's power, the cross is a stumbling block, scandalon, which can also be translated offence. So then the combined judgment of Jews and Greeks is that the cross is offensively stupid, certainly not the wisdom and power they're seeking. And therefore this is a moment of maximal antithesis in Paul's argument. The cross couldn't be further from the wisdom the Greeks seek, nor could it be further from the power that the Jews desire. And this dismissal of the cross, on the grounds of its offensive stupidity, is represented in our diagram by a descending line leading downwards to the right of the cross. Jews and Greeks have failed to find the power and wisdom that they were looking for in the cross. They're repulsed by it, they turn away. And therefore the experience of the Jews and Greeks in Paul's discourse can be represented by the carrot shape, the little hat shape, forming the lower part of the diagram. In their search for powerful signs and wisdom, they encounter the word of the cross and find in it only stupidity and offence. And this, for my money, is where the rubber really hits the road. This is one key to understanding a distinctively biblical way of framing the relationship between Christianity on one side and our culture on the other. Because that same cross, that same moronic, offensive cross, the cross of a Christ crucified in weakness and in foolishness, that cross is proclaimed by the apostle to be the power and the wisdom of God. And now, therefore, we can follow the whole bottom left to top right diagonal. If the search for power and wisdom is to find its true object, then it must pass through the cross to find God's power and God's wisdom. Because, as Paul reminds his readers, the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. The weakness of God is stronger than human strength. And we can now also follow a V-shaped path through the top of the diagram. Christ crucified is revealed as God's true power and wisdom, more powerful and wise than the Jews and Greeks could ever dream. And so what Paul has achieved in this cruciform diagram is a way of relating culture to biblical values that includes both radical antithesis and radical affirmation. True wisdom is found in the most foolish of places, and true power is found in abject weakness. And if we think about this in relation to Niebuhr's modes of antithesis, analogy, paradox and transformation, we find something really interesting. All those Niebuhrian moments are present here in this passage. But importantly, they're not equally distributed throughout 1 Corinthians 1, nor is one of them alone the main emphasis of this passage. The rhythm of affirmation, denial and transformation that we find in this passage from 1 Corinthians parallels another threefold movement in the Bible. In fact, the threefold movement of the Bible as a whole, that of creation, fall and redemption. Now, obviously, there are differences between the creation, fall, redemption schema and Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians 1. For example, the cross is not the fall, but there are also important similarities that I don't want us to miss. Both 1 Corinthians 1 and the creation, fall, redemption schema tell a story. There's a temporal progression. They're not static. In both cases, the story is not linear. It's not a gradual accumulation or a gradual degradation. There are unexpected turning points in both stories. And also both stories incorporate a moment of profound negation. Although neither of them end with this moment, they don't deny it, or they don't pretend that it never happened either. Both of them, in short, 1 Corinthians 1 and the creation, fall, redemption schema, are complex and plotted frameworks for understanding and engaging with the world around us in a non-static way. So then let's try to deploy this Pauline schema to the values of our own cultural moments. How would Paul write 1 Parisians today, or 1 New Yorkers, or 1 Canterburyans? Well, let's consider what on many accounts is the core value of the modern liberal West, the value of freedom, liberty. Just like the wisdom and power of the cross that Paul evokes in 1 Corinthians 1, Christian freedom from the outside looks like the very antithesis of liberty, because it consists in nothing other than slavery to Christ and to one's neighbour. Jesus warns his followers, does he not, that everyone who wants to be first must be the slave of all in Mark 10:44. And Paul describes how Christ took the very nature of a servant and became obedient to death, with the exhortation that the Christians should have the same mindset in Philippians 2:5-8. Nevertheless, the Bible and Christian reflection throughout the history of the Church attest that slavery to Christ is in fact authentic freedom, the only true freedom. In language borrowed from 1 Corinthians 1, we might say that the slavery of the cross is freer than human freedom. So then, what can we learn from this way of looking at values such as freedom today? Well, first of all, I think that we should resist the temptation out of a sense of the need to emphasize the antithesis between Christ and culture. And we should resist the temptation to allow the airbrushing away of important contributions that Christians have made and continue to make to the establishment and the preservation of the civic freedoms that we all enjoy in modern Western societies. These very freedoms that we see denied and challenged in many parts of the world today. Secondly, we shouldn't, out of a misplaced sense of the need to emphasize the continuities between Christ and culture, collapse the distinctively cruciform account of freedom into our society's secular understandings. We should maintain the distinctiveness, the radical subversiveness of the Christian idea of freedom over and against our society's usual paradigms. Thirdly, a biblical approach to freedom also provides the Christian with tools for cultural critique. It equips her to make fresh and distinctive interventions into the different debates that are happening in our society at the moment. So, to take one example, it allows her to distance herself from this simplistic model that opposes utter, unconditioned freedom to absolute and abject slavery, and that can only ask the question, are we free or are we not free? I think that the Christian coming at this comes with a subtler question, which is not simply, are we free, but who are we serving? On the basis that we all serve somebody, that every freedom has its concomitant restrictions. Have we chosen our slavery wisely? Is the question that the Christian will want to ask, I think. Christians insist that every idea of freedom harbours a vision of the good. And every idea of freedom requires a concomitant denial or enslavement. So then let's return one final time to our central question. Let's use freedom as a litmus test, and let's ask again, are Christianity and the Bible on the one hand, and society on the other hand, in conflict in this area? Now, what's emerged as we've thought through this issue in conversation with Paul, I think, is that either answering simply yes or no to that question falls far short of the complexity of a biblical response. Because if we want to understand the relationship between biblical values and cultural values in a biblical way, then we need to use a biblical shape of thinking to do that. And the pattern, I think, that Paul is commending to us through his meditation on the cross in this passage is the pattern of creation, fall, and redemption. And when we do that, when we think about it using this biblical pattern, I think there emerges something rather wonderful. On the one hand, the antithesis between the culture and the Bible reveals itself to be much deeper, much more radical than we might have suspected. But also, and at the same time, we find that the affirmation of cultural values in the Bible is much deeper and much more far-reaching than we might have suspected.